welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us on what was a sunny evening a couple of minutes ago, but the sun seems to have gone in. Thank you very much for joining us. This meeting is titled Marxism and Imperialism. And if you hadn't already realized, this meeting couldn't be any more apt given what's going on in the world. We're seeing the US and Israeli war on Iran, and the untold chaos and carnage that is creating. Um, and it's very, very apparent that these sorts of discussions about imperialism, and the Marxist understanding of imperialism are incredibly current and incredibly relevant to what's going on in the world and helping us to understand what's going on, why it's going on, and what we can do about it. Um, you may notice that Sophie Johnson, who was listed to speak, isn't here to speak. We are delighted though that we are joined by Vlad, who is waving at us now, who is a lecturer at the University of Glasgow, and he is a long-time Counterfire member. And we're really, really delighted that he is joining us. He's going to speak to us for about 20 to 25 minutes. Then we're going to open it up for discussion. Remember that there is no question, no contribution too small. So please think about things that you might want to ask or points that you want to make, but don't be afraid to make those contributions. And then there will be time for announcements, quite a few announcements actually, at the end of this. So we hope to end by 8 o'clock at the very, very latest. So I look forward to it. I'm now going to hand over to Vlad. Vlad.
Thanks, Jonathan. Hi, everybody, and thanks for coming on what was a lovely sunny evening, as Jonathan was saying, or day. We still have the sun out in Glasgow, just probably for a couple more minutes. So this is a big sacrifice, I have to say, to be here with you. We don't get as much sun up here as maybe you do down in the south. That said, I think I'll march on to discuss imperialism and resistance to it in historical terms and today. And I want to start with perhaps something that many of us have been used to. I mean, as Jonathan says, we are witnessing a US-Israeli war as we speak in Iran. And US wars have been not far and few between. And for the last roughly 25 years or quarter century, when you think about world affairs, we have lived through a unprecedented period of world history where what we've seen is the rule of a single state over the world system. So a kind of unipolar world system in which the United States ruled the roost. That's despite a very long-term decline for the United States, which I'll discuss in a bit. Fundamentally and very crudely put, the United States at the end of the Second World War was a preeminent state in terms of world manufacturing. It stood at 53% of all world manufacturing. Today, that's declined to less than a fifth, somewhere between 15 and 20%, depending on how you calculate it. And that's a significant decline. It obviously isn't the only indication of US decline, but I'm just going to use that as an illustration of where the United States is at. This long decline has been offset to a degree by what the ruling class in the US in the 1990s decided was its best competitive advantage against all its competitors in world affairs, and that was its overwhelming military edge over something like its next 10 to 15 rivals combined. The US military is by far the biggest in the world. It has got bases across the world. It's a nuclear power. Its budget currently is over $1 trillion. And for the last couple of decades, the US strategy for maintaining its dominance in world affairs and forestalling the emergence of rivals was to use its military advantage to maintain markets, to maintain strategic points in in the world, and so on. And all you need to think about in terms of just how powerful the United States was in the last 25 years is you need to remember wars like the Afghan War and the Iraq War. Um, these were very initially successful invasions of countries far away from the United States. The United States was able to overwhelm them and establish occupations. Now, it is true that all these occupations ended in essentially American withdrawal. In Afghanistan, it took 2 decades, but nevertheless, the point was there was resistance, and the United States was forced to withdraw. All the same, its military position, when you think about it in global terms, was seemingly pretty secure. And not even that long ago, just after the 1st of January this year, we saw the United States use overwhelming American power to come in and out of Venezuela and kidnap its president, Nicolas Maduro, in a way subordinating the Venezuelan regime to US imperialism, seemingly with extreme ease and the use of military force. Now, in some ways, right, this is one element of the story, American predominance in world affairs for the last 25 years. But at the same time, we've seen this war started with Israel in the last couple of days, and that's not looking so great for the US. In a straight fight, of course, the United States would easily defeat Iran. If this was simply a question of who's the bigger military power, there's no comparison. However, what we're also witnessing is the United States and Donald Trump in particular talking about and looking for an off-ramp. It's very clear that he's desperate to get out. He called for regime change. That didn't happen, but days later he said America had more or less reached all its goals. The markets welcome this news. Oil prices dropped for a bit, but then he carried on. He said he wasn't quite done, but he keeps looking for ways to get out. He's been calling on the help of allies and China alike to help him patrol the Strait of Hormuz. And this is quite an unprecedented situation for the United States. It looks very much like it's entered a war for which it has no obvious endpoint, and it looks like it could end in a strategic defeat. In other words, if the United States does not get regime change anytime soon, this is a huge problem for the US. And what is very obvious when you look at what the United States is doing is, despite its military prowess and its, if you like, advantage and significant strength compared with Iran, Iran is managing to do something that few people expected. It's using economic warfare to put the United States in trouble. Fundamentally, it's quite clear that Trump is, as it were, spooked by the markets, quote unquote. Iran is able to use its strategic position to blockade the Strait of Hormuz, a bit of sea through which something like a fifth of all oil and gas is transported in the world. It's quite clearly a significant trade route. Iran is also able to use a small number of missiles to knock out energy facilities in neighboring Gulf states. The Middle East is clearly critical for the supplies of energy for significant sections of the world economy, not least the US major rival in economic terms, China. Okay, and that brings me, if you like, to the point I'm trying to make overall. Right? If once upon a time the United States as a state was able to dominate the world and the world economy, it seems now that it's to a much greater degree beholden to what happens in the world economy. It no longer controls it. Its attack on Iran is something that is unable economically to withstand. Many countries who looked to the United States as a force of some kind of order, however unjust, are now wondering what on earth the world economy is going to look like when there is no hegemon looking over it. And I want to home in on this contradiction, if you like, between the US as a nation state and the world economy, and talk about the Marxist theory of imperialism. And here I'm going to plug a book. It's quite old. I don't know if you're able to see it given how I've set up my screen. I don't think you can. It's Imperialism and Resistance by John Rees. And it's got a really good summary in the first chapter of the Marxist approach to imperialism, and I'm going to summarize that for you in this talk. John Rees talks about a central dynamic in the modern world as the intersection of three great titans. And these three titans are modern nation states, the international economy, and the global working class. Now, all of these three were born with capitalism in Britain and Holland in the 17th century. In the 1600s, this system of capitalism spread to France, Italy, Germany, the United States in the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, and then, of course, went global. Now, I just want to home in a little bit on this process and talk about what it all means. What is a modern nation state? Well, it's a geographically bound system with a monopoly of violence, right? When you think about the history of states pre-modern, pre-capitalist states, they did not quite have the level of control over their territories that states do now. They employ large numbers of people, and in particular, they have huge armies and repressive apparatuses in a way that did not exist before. We also get a competitive world market. So what we get is the growth of productive forces under capitalism, the concentration and centralization of capital, the growth of what we might call today modern corporations that outgrow their domestic market, geographically speaking, in the nation state, and begin to fight a competitive struggle over resources and profits on a global scale. And that's the international kind of world economy bit. And of course, these two depend to a large degree on a free labor force, a labor force that for the first time in world history is expropriated. It's separated from the means of production. It is forced to sell its labor power in order to survive, and it's essentially an exploited class that produces all the goods and services that capitalism needs. This triad, the modern state, the international economy, and the global working class, are all interrelated, but at the same time they form a very contradictory and unstable unity. Okay, and I want to talk a little bit about how that functions. What we see historically is as the productive forces outgrow the nation state, they begin to compete internationally, and for this they need the support of their state, and vice versa. States, in competing with each other and in an international interstate system, rely ever more on the efficiency of their economies to compete with each other and to build up military strength. Ultimately, for corporations to function globally, they rely on their states for support domestically, but also crucially through their reliance on their states to be able to militarily defend markets, trade routes, and so on. Now, these two are also in an uneasy coexistence with workers on whom they depend. Workers, however, are necessary for both, but they're home in neither. They're oppressed and exploited by corporations and the states that defend them. And how does this historically manifest? Well, here's a very very quick history of world capitalism since then. In the 19th century, we have the growth of the European empires. They divide up the world among themselves. 90% of Africa, for example, is colonized by the end of the 19th century, showing just how far capitalism is spreading through empire. The European empires slog it out amongst each other, and ultimately, over two world wars, they exhaust each other, particularly the United Kingdom and France on the one hand, and Germany as their challenger on the other. This process ends with Europe diminished on a global scale, and two non-European powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, replacing them as the two great powers of world capitalism. Then they slog it out over the Cold War, ultimately ending with a victory for the United States. The whole time, these processes of competition and war are accompanied by extreme forms of resistance by the populations over whom capitalism rules. At the end of the First World War, we have a tidal wave of revolution, including the Russian Revolution, the first communist revolution in world history. After the Second World War, there's major upheaval and also major anti-colonial struggles in the global South. At the end of the Cold War, of course, we have major rebellions within the Soviet world, including Solidarity, the biggest trade union, and in the Soviet bloc in Poland. In all of these, if you like, there is a visible interplay between, as we were saying, the nation state, the international economy, and the global working class. I'm going to pick up therefore where I started off with the unipolar moment and the triumph of the United States at the end of the Cold War. As the United States, as we said, stands supreme at the end as the regulator of world capitalism, as the military force. It is also the state that is able to shape the global system in its image for several decades afterwards. But I think what is visible in the last 25 years is just how far the international economy is escaping from the control of this one state. So that contradiction between the nation states and the international economy grows. And in particular, what we see is the emergence of rivals to the United States. If the US was, as I was saying earlier, accounting for over half of all global manufacturing and had dropped to less than 20%. Now, what we see is the rise of China, which produces around about a third of all global manufacturing. And the irony is, when you think about the last couple of decades, is that the United States was precisely the country that was championing the growth of globalization, what was called the Washington Consensus at the end of the Cold War, deregulation, the shipping of production abroad from the countries of advanced capitalism elsewhere. And all this, ironically, leads to the rise of rivals like China. China is able to start producing very cheaply. It uses its position as a backward state, in effect, to begin to be a major manufacturer, a major exporter, and in a way to turn the tables on the United States as the workshop of the world. As we see US decline in the economy, we also begin to see those rivals that are emerging in world affairs able to also militarily challenge it. And one example of this in the last few years has been the decision of the Russian state since about 2008 and the great crisis of neoliberalism to militarily project power in Georgia, and then again in Ukraine in 2014 and again in 2022 with the full-scale invasion. The Russian state was clearly, as it were, motivated by a desire to pull back what the Soviet Union had lost at the end of the Cold War, to say no to further NATO expansion. And it was using, a bit like the United States, its military advantage locally in the region around it to forestall its own economic decline. But world affairs in general as a whole has become far less stable with the emergence of multipolarity. That brings us, if you like, to the current situation in the Middle East as well, through which we should probably try to make sense of what Donald Trump is doing. When Donald Trump took power, he was very adamant that the era of globalization, as he called it, and American hegemony had come to an end. He said it was an immense waste of resources for the United States to have tried to rule the world, etc., etc. He was billing himself as the peace president. I just saw a tweet that he put up in October 2019 where he said things like, going into the Middle East was the biggest mistake ever of the United States. It had lost thousands of troops and killed millions of people on the other side. It should never have been done. And here he is in the Middle East doing roughly the same thing. So why is that? And I think it's enough to just read the US National Security Strategy published in December last year to understand some of what is going on. Trump is very much on the wing of the United States ruling class that is saying, look, we've overstretched, right? We need to slightly downscale what we're doing, and we need to be smarter about it. We need to come to terms with some of our competitors, but we also need to be ruthless in putting America first, right? In a sense, we've been far too kind. We've given too much to the United Nations. We've given too much to international aid. What we need to be doing is more ruthlessly pursuing our own interests. That means more robustness with China, a greater defense of the Western Hemisphere, hence the attacks on Venezuela and the coming one on Cuba, the blockade, and all the rest of it. But critically, the Middle East, which for a long time was central to world politics, remains an important geographic location in geopolitical and economic terms, right? And as I was saying, the fact that China gets most of its oil from the Middle East, it's energy dependent, suggests that the US was very aware. Trump was very aware that his military adventure was aimed fundamentally at shoring up the US position in world affairs against China. So I think we should probably take with a pinch of salt all the claims that it's really Israel dictating American policy. It's very clear that the United States has a reason of its own for being in the Middle East and doing what it's doing. That doesn't negate the fact that there's clear tensions with Israel either over how this war is being fought. But maybe we can come back to that in the discussion. I guess I want to conclude a little bit, though, on where we are in world affairs right now as a result. What we are seeing is the increase of interstate violence on a grand scale, pretty much since 2008, but over the last 5 or 6 years since the coronavirus pandemic. The Russian invasion of Ukraine was followed by a war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, where hundreds of thousands were ethnically cleansed. We've seen the Israeli genocide in Gaza. It's multitude of wars against Lebanon, against Yemen, against Iran. The regime change in Syria. We've seen the US hit Venezuela and Nigeria and Iran twice. This is the sign of a world in great turbulence, in great change. And the temptation of the big states to use military force in order to shore up their position is only going to increase in such circumstances, particularly as they see the United States foundering. Trump particularly seems like an erratic guy at the top, and nothing would seem surprising. He might chicken out, as the joke goes about Trump. He always chickens out. But he might also be tempted, given how badly things are going, to use a nuclear bomb. It's all really up for grabs. And I want to finally perhaps come back to the UK and Europe as part of this discussion to make a last point, which is that when you look at the world, the position of Europe in the world, its decline is even sharper than that of the United States. It is roughly at half of where it was in 1980 in terms of global share of international trade. Its GDP has declined significantly compared to that of the United States, and so on. And moreover, Europe is a major energy importer, which makes wars like this one particularly bad for Europe. within this particular storyline, it's also clear that the United Kingdom, as part of that story, uh, remains incredibly subordinate to the United States in terms of what its ruling classes are doing. It remains joined at the hip with the United States, which is how the UK establishment has dealt with UK decline in world affairs since the Second World War, tagging along with the Americans in every attempt at keeping its interests protected. And it's been incredibly craven from places like Gaza to Iran today. Starmer's genuflections and intellectual incongruity in terms of what he's done since the beginning of this war are patent to everyone. He said he wasn't going to get involved, then he let the US use UK bases just after saying he wasn't going to do that, sending ships to defend against unprovoked Iranian aggression, etc., etc. This all speaks to the UK still following the lead of the US, meanwhile also being increasingly aware of just how bad all this looks. That all said, right, I don't think that we should end on a note of depression. I think one of the things that's become quite clear over the last couple of years is just how huge the anti-war movement has been across Europe, but in particular in the UK over Palestine. There's also been a general strike in Italy against Italy's participation in the Israeli genocide in Gaza. All of this points to I think the possibility of the global working class being a force to be reckoned with as our rulers show how incompetent they are, and as they try to transform the world ever more in that aggressive image where in a multipolar world they have to fight it out against each other. And I think in particular Europe's rather hapless attempts at creating some kind of autonomy for itself in world affairs through rearmament is a good example of this. They're trying to turn welfare states into warfare states. That's going to be an incredibly unpopular thing to do in the next few years. And I think it shows just how important the anti-war movement is, not just in terms of foreign policy, but domestic policy. And it is important to try to politicize this from the left and to prevent it going in the direction of the far right and false stories like Trump's that they are really the peacemakers. As we've seen in the last few years, they do the exact opposite every time they take power. So it's important for us to be the voice of the working class in saying no to conscription, no to turning the welfare state into the warfare state, and in effect saying no to imperialism becoming the gravediggers of the imperialist system as a whole.